In the rigid world of military protocol, where rank determines respect and silence often protects careers, one moment of violence during a routine training exercise would expose a web of corruption, abuse, and cover-ups that reached the highest levels of command. What began as a single strike during a drill would ultimately bring down not just the perpetrator, but 4 high-ranking colonels whose careers had been built on a foundation of intimidation and misconduct. This is the story of how one act of brutality became the catalyst that shattered an entire military network of power and abuse, proving that even in the most hierarchical institutions, justice can still find a way to prevail.
The military had always prided itself on honor, duty, and protecting those who serve.
But sometimes, the very people sworn to uphold these values become the ones who violate them most severely. This is one of those stories, a true account of how the courage of a few would topple the careers of many, and how a single moment of witnessed violence would unravel decades of hidden misconduct. The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Richardson as Sergeant Maria Santos prepared for what she believed would be another routine training exercise. The Alaskan military base hummed with its usual pre-dawn activity, soldiers moving with practiced efficiency toward their assigned positions. Santos had been stationed here for 3 years, long enough to know the rhythms of military life, but not long enough to recognize the warning signs that this particular day would alter the trajectory of multiple careers and expose a culture of abuse that had festered in the shadows for years. Colonel Richard Blackwood stood at the observation platform, his imposing 6'4" frame casting an intimidating presence over the training grounds. At 48, Blackwood had built his reputation on being a demanding officer who expected perfection from his subordinates. His chest bore the ribbons of numerous commendations, and his promotion record was spotless, at least on paper. What the official records didn't capture was the fear that rippled through the ranks whenever his name was mentioned in conversation, or the way junior officers would suddenly find urgent business elsewhere when he approached. The training exercise was designed to test combat readiness under pressure. Soldiers were required to navigate a complex obstacle course while responding to simulated enemy fire and coordinating with their units through radio communication. It was the kind of high-stress scenario that revealed both strengths and weaknesses in military personnel, and Blackwood took particular interest in identifying what he perceived as weaknesses. Private Jennifer Hayes was 22 years old, barely 8 months out of basic training, and desperately trying to prove herself worthy of her position. She had joined the military against her family's wishes, driven by a desire to serve her country and build a career that would provide stability and purpose. Hayes was small in stature but determined in spirit, often staying after hours to practice drills and improve her physical conditioning. Her dedication had earned the respect of her peers, but it had also caught the attention of Blackwood, who seemed to view her determination as a challenge to his authority. As the exercise began, Hayes moved through the initial obstacles with competence, her radio communications clear and her responses appropriate to the simulated scenarios. She had trained extensively for this moment, understanding that her performance would influence her future assignments and advancement opportunities. The morning air was crisp, carrying the sounds of shouted commands and the thunder of blank ammunition as soldiers engaged with imaginary enemies. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, Blackwood's second-in-command, watched the proceedings from a nearby position. Morrison had served under Blackwood for 18 months and had witnessed behavior that troubled him, though he had never found the courage to report it through official channels. The military's chain of command structure made such reports risky for one's career, and Morrison had a family to support and retirement to consider. He told himself that he was probably overreacting to Blackwood's intense leadership style, even as a nagging voice in his conscience suggested otherwise. The trouble began during the third phase of the exercise, when Hayes encountered a communications equipment malfunction. Her radio crackled with static, making it difficult to receive clear instructions from her unit commander. Standard protocol called for soldiers to adapt to such technical difficulties, using hand signals or alternative communication methods to maintain coordination with their team. Hayes attempted to signal her situation to her squad leader while continuing to advance through the obstacle course. Blackwood observed the developing situation from his elevated position, his jaw tightening as he watched Hayes struggle with the communication breakdown. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of weakness that had no place in a properly functioning military unit. He had built his career on the belief that soldiers needed to be pushed beyond their comfort zones, that only through extreme pressure could they develop the resilience necessary for real combat situations. What he failed to recognize was the difference between demanding excellence and creating an environment of fear and intimidation. As Hayes continued to navigate the obstacles while attempting to re-establish communication, her movements became slightly less coordinated. The stress of the malfunctioning equipment, combined with the awareness that she was being closely observed by senior officers, began to affect her performance. She stumbled slightly while climbing over a wooden barrier, catching herself quickly but losing precious seconds in the process. The other soldiers in the exercise continued their own challenges, most of them unaware of the drama unfolding around Hayes. The training ground was large enough that individual struggles often went unnoticed by those not directly involved. However, several non-commissioned officers had positioned themselves strategically to observe the entire exercise, making mental notes about each soldier's performance for later evaluation and feedback. Sergeant First Class David Chen, a veteran with 12 years of service, noticed Hayes' equipment problems and began moving in her direction to provide assistance. Chen had a reputation as a steady, reliable leader who looked out for the soldiers under his supervision. He understood that equipment failures were part of military life and that how a soldier responded to such challenges was often more important than their performance under ideal conditions. As he approached Hayes' position, he prepared to offer guidance and support. Blackwood's attention remained fixed on Hayes as she worked to complete the obstacle course despite her communication difficulties. His expression grew increasingly stern as he watched what he perceived as inadequate performance under pressure. In his mind, a competent soldier should be able to overcome such minor technical problems without any visible signs of stress or confusion. The fact that Hayes was struggling only reinforced his belief that she was not suitable for military service. The critical moment arrived when Hayes reached a section of the course that required precise timing and coordination with other team members. Without clear radio communication, she had to rely on visual cues and her understanding of the exercise parameters to make decisions about when and how to proceed. She paused momentarily, scanning the area for signs from her teammates and trying to assess the best course of action. This pause proved to be the catalyst for what followed. Blackwood interpreted her momentary hesitation as evidence of indecision and incompetence. His frustration, which had been building throughout the morning, finally boiled over. He left his observation position and strode purposefully toward the training area, his intent clear to anyone who knew his temperament well enough to read the warning signs. Morrison watched with growing concern as Blackwood approached the active training zone. It was unusual for senior officers to intervene directly in ongoing exercises unless there was a safety emergency or serious misconduct. The intensity of Blackwood's movement suggested that he was about to take some kind of disciplinary action, though Morrison hoped it would be limited to verbal correction or guidance. Hayes, still focused on completing the exercise and unaware of Blackwood's approach, finally decided on a course of action and began to move forward. Her decision was tactically sound given the information available to her, but it came too late to satisfy Blackwood's expectations. As she advanced through the next obstacle, concentrating on her footing and scanning for potential hazards, she failed to notice the approaching figure of her commanding officer. The collision of expectations and reality came to a head in the span of just a few seconds. Blackwood reached Hayes' position just as she was navigating a particularly challenging section of the course. His presence startled her, causing her to lose focus momentarily and stumble slightly. This reaction, which would have been completely understandable to any reasonable observer, was the final straw for Blackwood. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every witness and become the foundation for investigations that would ultimately destroy multiple careers. In a moment of unchecked rage, Blackwood raised his hand and struck Hayes across the face with sufficient force to knock her to the ground. The sound of the impact carried across the training area, immediately silencing the ongoing exercise as soldiers and officers alike turned to witness the unprecedented scene. Hayes lay on the ground for several seconds, stunned by both the physical impact and the complete violation of military protocol and basic human decency. Blood trickled from her nose as she slowly pushed herself up to a sitting position, her eyes wide with shock and confusion. The other soldiers in the immediate area stood frozen, unsure how to respond to such an extraordinary breach of conduct from a senior officer. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he witnessed the assault. Every instinct told him to intervene, to rush to Hayes' aid, and confront Blackwood about his inexcusable behavior. However, the rigid structure of military hierarchy and his own career concerns held him in place, creating an internal conflict that would haunt him for weeks to come. He knew that what he had just witnessed was not only morally wrong, but also a serious violation of military law and regulations. Blackwood stood over Hayes, his face flushed with anger and his hands clenched into fists. For a moment it appeared as though he might strike her again, but the shocked silence of the assembled soldiers seemed to penetrate his rage and bring him back to some semblance of awareness of his surroundings. The realization of what he had done began to dawn on him. though his immediate response was not remorse but rather a calculating assessment of how to minimize the consequences of his actions. The training exercise came to an immediate halt as word of the incident spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had not directly witnessed the assault quickly learned of it through hushed conversations and concerned glances. The atmosphere on the base shifted palpably, with an underlying tension that hadn't existed just minutes before. Everyone understood that something significant had just occurred, though few could have predicted the far-reaching consequences that would follow. Hayes slowly got to her feet with assistance from Sergeant Chen, who had finally reached her position. Chen's face was a mask of controlled fury as he helped her steady herself and offered her a clean cloth for her bleeding nose. His years of experience had taught him to maintain discipline even in the most challenging circumstances. But witnessing a senior officer assault a subordinate tested every professional instinct he possessed. The immediate aftermath of the incident was characterized by a surreal quiet as both officers and enlisted personnel grappled with the implications of what they had just witnessed. Military culture emphasized respect for authority and chain of command, but it also stressed the importance of protecting fellow service members and maintaining standards of conduct. The tension between these competing values created a complex situation that had no clear precedent in most soldiers' experience. As Hayes was escorted to the medical facility for evaluation and treatment, whispered conversations began to spread throughout the base. Some soldiers expressed outrage at Blackwood's behavior, while others worried about the potential consequences of speaking out against a senior officer. The military system of justice and accountability was about to face a test that would reveal both its strengths and its fundamental weaknesses. The seeds of a much larger scandal had been planted in that moment of violence on the training ground. What none of the witnesses could have anticipated was that this single incident would eventually expose a network of misconduct and abuse that reached the highest levels of the base's command structure, implicating 4 colonels and forcing the military to confront uncomfortable truths about its own culture and accountability mechanisms. The base medical facility had seen its share of training injuries over the years, but the arrival of Private Hayes with a bloodied nose and the shell-shocked expression of someone who had experienced something far beyond a routine accident immediately caught the attention of the medical staff. Captain Sarah Williams, the attending physician, had been treating military personnel for 6 years and had developed an instinct for distinguishing between legitimate training injuries and something more troubling. The way Hayes flinched when Williams approached, and the nervous glances exchanged by the soldiers who accompanied her, suggested that this case would require more than just medical attention. As Williams examined Hayes's injuries, she noticed bruising patterns that were inconsistent with typical training accidents. The mark on Hayes's face bore the clear outline of fingers, and the angle of impact suggested a deliberate strike rather than accidental contact with equipment or obstacles. Williams had completed specialized training in recognizing signs of abuse and assault, knowledge that had become increasingly relevant as the military grappled with widespread issues of misconduct and violence within its ranks. Hayes remained largely silent during the initial examination, answering medical questions with minimal responses and avoiding eye contact with the medical staff. Her behavior exhibited classic signs of someone who had experienced trauma and was uncertain about how to proceed or whom to trust. Williams recognized these symptoms and approached the situation with the sensitivity and professionalism that such cases demanded, though she was already mentally preparing the documentation that would be required if this incident escalated to an official investigation. Meanwhile, in his office across the base, Colonel Blackwood was experiencing his own form of psychological aftermath from the morning's events. The immediate rush of anger that had driven him to strike Hayes had subsided, replaced by a cold calculation of the potential damage to his career and reputation. Blackwood had worked too hard and climbed too high in the military hierarchy to allow one moment of lost control to destroy everything he had built. His mind raced through possible strategies for minimizing the consequences of his actions. The first call Blackwood made was to Colonel Patricia Vance, the base's chief administrative officer, and someone whose career had become intertwined with his own over the past several years. Vance had a reputation for being highly competent at managing difficult situations and had helped Blackwood navigate previous challenges to his leadership, though none had been as serious or as publicly witnessed as this morning's incident. Their relationship extended beyond mere professional cooperation, encompassing a mutual understanding that their careers could rise or fall together. Vance arrived at Blackwood's office within 15 minutes of his call, her expression carefully neutral as she listened to his version of events. According to Blackwood's account, Hayes had demonstrated gross incompetence during the training exercise, creating a safety hazard that required immediate intervention. He claimed that his physical contact with her had been necessary to prevent a more serious accident, and that her injuries were the result of her own clumsiness rather than any excessive force on his part. As Blackwood spoke, Vance mentally catalogued the inconsistencies and omissions in his story, recognizing the signs of someone attempting to construct a narrative that would minimize legal and professional consequences. Her years of experience in military administration had taught her to identify when officers were trying to cover up misconduct, though she had never before been asked to participate directly in such an effort. The request Blackwood was making, though never explicitly stated, was clear. He needed her help to contain the situation and protect both of their careers. The complexity of Vance's position was compounded by her knowledge of similar incidents that had occurred under Blackwood's command over the past 2 years. She had helped to quietly transfer soldiers who had complained about his behavior, processed paperwork that minimized the significance of previous allegations, and participated in performance evaluations that failed to document patterns of concerning conduct. Each of these individual actions had seemed manageable at the time, but collectively they represented a systematic effort to shield Blackwood from accountability. Colonel Marcus Thompson, the base commander, became aware of the morning's events through unofficial channels before any formal report reached his desk. Thompson had commanded Fort Richardson for 3 years and had built his reputation on maintaining discipline and order while avoiding the kind of high-profile scandals that could damage both individual careers and the military's public image. His initial reaction to hearing about Blackwood's conduct was a mixture of anger at the stupidity of such behavior and concern about how to contain the potential fallout. Thompson's relationship with Blackwood was complicated by both personal and professional considerations. They had served together at previous assignments and had developed what Thompson considered to be a mentorship relationship with Blackwood as the younger officer. Thompson had been instrumental in securing several of Blackwood's promotions and had recommended him for his current position, despite some concerns about his temperament and leadership style. The prospect that his protégé had committed such a serious offense created both professional and personal challenges. The fourth colonel who would eventually become entangled in the scandal was Robert Hayes, no relation to Private Hayes, who served as the base's Inspector General. Colonel Hayes held the position specifically responsible for investigating allegations of misconduct and ensuring compliance with military regulations and standards. His role should have made him a natural ally for anyone seeking justice in cases of officer misconduct, but his own career ambitions and relationships within the command structure had compromised his independence and objectivity. Hayes had developed close working relationships with the other colonels over the course of several years, relationships that had proven beneficial for his own career advancement and social standing within the military community. The prospect of investigating serious misconduct allegations against his colleagues presented a direct conflict between his official duties and his personal interests, a conflict that would ultimately be resolved in favor of protecting the existing power structure rather than pursuing justice. As news of the incident continued to spread through informal channels, the four colonels began a series of conversations and meetings designed to coordinate their response and minimize the potential damage to their careers. These discussions, which would later become crucial evidence in their eventual downfall, revealed the extent to which they were willing to manipulate the military justice system to protect themselves and each other. The strategy that emerged from these conversations involved multiple components, each designed to discredit Hayes's account of events while portraying Blackwood's actions as either justified or significantly less serious than they actually were. The first element involved questioning Hayes's mental stability and suggesting that she had fabricated or exaggerated her allegations due to stress or personal problems. This approach required accessing her medical records and personnel files to identify any information that could be used to undermine her credibility. Vance took responsibility for reviewing Hayes's personnel file and medical history, looking for evidence of previous psychological issues, disciplinary problems, or other factors that could be used to suggest she was an unreliable witness. This review, which violated numerous regulations regarding confidentiality and proper use of personnel information, revealed that Hayes had sought counseling for anxiety issues related to adjusting to military life. While such counseling was common and encouraged for new military personnel, Vance recognized that it could be manipulated to suggest mental instability. The second component of their strategy involved pressuring potential witnesses to either remain silent or alter their accounts of what they had observed. This effort required careful coordination to avoid creating obvious evidence of witness tampering or obstruction of justice. Thompson used his position as base commander to conduct informal conversations with key witnesses, ostensibly as part of his normal leadership duties, but actually designed to gauge their willingness to support the official version of events. During these conversations, Thompson employed a combination of subtle intimidation and appeals to unit loyalty to discourage witnesses from providing accurate accounts of what they had seen. He reminded soldiers about the importance of supporting their chain of command and suggested that making allegations against senior officers could be detrimental to unit cohesion and their own career prospects. While he was careful never to explicitly threaten retaliation, the implication was clear to anyone familiar with military culture and power dynamics. Colonel Hayes, in his role as Inspector General, began preparing what would ostensibly be an objective investigation into the incident, but was actually designed to reach predetermined conclusions that would exonerate Blackwood and discredit Private Hayes. This preparation involved identifying friendly witnesses who could be counted on to support the official narrative and developing questions that would elicit responses favorable to Blackwood while making Private Hayes appear confused or unreliable. The manipulation of the investigation process represented perhaps the most serious abuse of authority committed by the four colonels, as it directly undermined the military justice system's ability to hold officers accountable for their actions. Hayes's willingness to corrupt his official duties in service of protecting his colleagues demonstrated the extent to which personal relationships and career considerations had superseded professional ethics and legal obligations. As these behind-the-scenes efforts continued, Private Hayes remained in the medical facility under observation for what was officially described as training-related injuries requiring extended evaluation. Captain Williams had documented her injuries thoroughly and had begun to suspect that the official account of how Hayes sustained those injuries was incomplete or inaccurate. However, Williams also understood the potential consequences of challenging senior officers' version of events, particularly without clear evidence or support from higher authorities. The isolation of Private Hayes from her unit and fellow soldiers served multiple purposes for the colonel's cover-up efforts. It prevented her from coordinating with potential witnesses or receiving advice about her legal rights and options. It also provided time for the colonels to implement their strategy and establish their preferred narrative before Hayes could tell her story to anyone in a position to take official action on her behalf. Sergeant First Class Chen, who had witnessed the assault and assisted Hayes immediately afterward, found himself under increasing pressure to modify his account of events. His initial statement had been straightforward and damning to Blackwood, clearly describing the unprovoked nature of the attack, and Hayes's complete lack of any threatening or inappropriate behavior. However, subsequent conversations with his superiors had made it clear that maintaining this account could have serious consequences for his career and future assignments. The pressure on Chen intensified when he was called to a meeting with Colonel Thompson, ostensibly for a routine performance review, but actually designed to gauge his loyalty and willingness to cooperate with the cover-up. Thompson's approach was subtle but unmistakable, combining praise for Chen's service record with gentle suggestions that his recollection of recent events might be incomplete or influenced by the stress and confusion of the moment. Chen faced an impossible choice between telling the truth about what he had witnessed and protecting his own career and family's financial security. As a career soldier with significant time invested in military service, the prospect of retaliation through poor evaluations, undesirable assignments, or other forms of professional punishment represented a genuine threat to his livelihood and future prospects. The military's hierarchical structure and culture of obedience to authority created an environment where challenging senior officers required extraordinary courage and often resulted in personal sacrifice. The systematic nature of the cover-up efforts extended beyond just the immediate witnesses to include administrative personnel responsible for maintaining official records and documentation. The colonel's influence over these support systems allowed them to ensure that official reports and records would support their preferred version of events, creating a paper trail that would appear to validate their claims while obscuring evidence of misconduct and witness tampering. As the first week following the incident drew to a close, it appeared that the colonel's strategy might be successful. Private Hayes remained isolated and without meaningful support. Potential witnesses were being effectively intimidated into silence or compliance, and the official investigation was being structured to reach conclusions favorable to Blackwood. The military justice system, which was designed to ensure accountability and protect service members from abuse, was being systematically manipulated to serve the interests of those in power, rather than pursue truth and justice. However, the colonels had underestimated both the determination of some individuals to see justice done and the military's own institutional mechanisms for detecting and responding to corruption and abuse of authority. The seeds of their eventual downfall had already been planted, though it would take months for the full extent of their misconduct to be exposed and addressed through appropriate legal channels. The turning point in the case came when Captain Martinez successfully petitioned for an independent investigation by the Army Criminal Investigation Division, bypassing the compromised internal investigation that Colonel Hayes had been conducting. The CID's involvement brought federal law enforcement resources and expertise that were beyond the reach of the base command structure, fundamentally altering the power dynamics that had allowed the cover-up to continue unchecked for nearly 3 weeks. Special Agent Diana Rodriguez arrived at Fort Richardson on a cold Monday morning in November, carrying with her the authority of the Department of Defense and a reputation for pursuing military justice cases with relentless thoroughness. Rodriguez had spent 8 years investigating military crimes, including several high-profile cases involving abuse of authority and obstruction of justice. Her experience had taught her to recognize the patterns of behavior that typically accompanied cover-up efforts, and the preliminary information she had received about the Fort Richardson case exhibited all the classic warning signs. Rodriguez's first action was to secure all relevant evidence and documentation before it could be further altered or destroyed by those seeking to hide their involvement in misconduct. Her team arrived with federal search warrants that gave them access to personnel files, medical records, communication logs, and any other materials that might be relevant to their investigation. The speed and scope of this evidence preservation effort caught the colonels off guard and prevented them from destroying or altering additional evidence. The CID's approach differed fundamentally from the internal investigation that had been underway, focusing on building a comprehensive understanding of all the misconduct that had occurred rather than simply examining the original assault allegation. Rodriguez recognized that the cover-up efforts represented serious crimes in their own right and that the pattern of behavior suggested systemic problems that required thorough investigation and prosecution. Agent Rodriguez's first interview was with Private Hayes, who had been moved to a secure location off the base to ensure her safety and prevent further intimidation by those seeking to suppress her testimony. Hayes's account of events was consistent with her original statement and provided detailed information about the assault and the subsequent pressure she had received to remain silent or alter her story. Her testimony also revealed additional instances of inappropriate behavior by Colonel Blackwood that had not been previously reported or investigated. The private's detailed recollection of events, combined with the physical evidence documented by Captain Williams and the electronic records secured by the CID team, provided a solid foundation for prosecution of the original assault charges against Blackwood. However, Rodriguez was more interested in the elaborate cover-up that had followed the incident, recognizing that the abuse of authority and obstruction of justice represented potentially more serious offenses than the original assault. Rodriguez's interview with Sergeant First Class Chen revealed the extent of the pressure that had been applied to witnesses and the systematic nature of the efforts to manipulate testimony and evidence. Chen's account provided crucial insight into the methods used by the colonels to intimidate witnesses and the coordination that had occurred between different officers to ensure their cover-up efforts were consistent and effective. The sergeant's relief at finally being able to tell the truth about what he had witnessed was evident throughout the interview, though his testimony also revealed the psychological toll that the pressure to participate in the cover-up had taken on him and his family. Rodriguez understood that Chen's cooperation would be essential to building a comprehensive case against the colonels, but she also recognized the courage it had taken for him to resist the pressure he had faced and ultimately agree to testify truthfully. Lieutenant Mitchell's technical expertise proved invaluable to the investigation, as she was able to provide detailed analysis of communication records and electronic evidence that revealed the timing and coordination of the colonel's activities following the assault. Her documentation showed clear patterns of unusual access to secure systems and databases that corresponded with efforts to gather information about potential witnesses and victims. Mitchell's evidence was particularly damaging to Colonel Vance, whose administrative position had given her access to personnel files and other sensitive information that she had used to support the cover-up efforts. The electronic audit trails maintained by the base's computer systems provided irrefutable evidence of when specific files had been accessed, by whom, and for how long, creating a detailed picture of the unauthorized surveillance and information gathering that had taken place. Captain Williams's medical documentation provided crucial physical evidence of the assault, while also revealing attempts to pressure her into altering her professional assessment of Hayes's injuries. Williams had secretly maintained copies of her original unaltered medical reports and had documented the pressure she had received to change her conclusions about the cause and severity of Hayes's trauma. This evidence was particularly important because it demonstrated the systematic nature of the evidence tampering efforts. The physician's testimony also revealed additional cases of suspicious injuries among female soldiers under Blackwood's command, suggesting a pattern of violence and abuse that extended far beyond the single incident involving Private Hayes. Williams had maintained detailed medical records that documented concerning injury patterns over a period of several months, evidence that she had been afraid to report through official channels due to the retaliation she anticipated from senior officers. As the CID investigation expanded, Rodriguez uncovered evidence of financial improprieties and administrative misconduct that went far beyond the immediate cover-up efforts. Colonel Thompson's abuse of his authority as base commander included the misuse of government resources for personal benefit and the manipulation of personnel assignments to reward loyalty and punish those who posed threats to his authority. These additional crimes provided prosecutors with multiple charges that could be brought against the base commander. Colonel Hayes's corruption of his official duties as Inspector General was particularly serious because it represented a fundamental violation of the military justice system's integrity. The evidence revealed that he had participated in cover-up efforts in previous cases involving allegations of misconduct by senior officers, establishing a pattern of behavior that made him unfit for his position and potentially subject to prosecution for multiple counts of obstruction of justice and abuse of authority. The investigation also revealed that Colonel Vance had used her access to personnel systems to conduct unauthorized surveillance of soldiers who had made complaints about their superiors, information that was then used to intimidate or discredit those who sought justice through official channels. Her activities represented serious violations of privacy rights and federal laws governing the handling of personnel information, charges that could result in both military and civilian prosecution. The evidence against Colonel Blackwood extended far beyond the original assault charge, revealing a pattern of violence and abuse that had been systematically concealed through the coordinated efforts of his colleagues and superiors. The CID investigation uncovered multiple instances of physical violence, sexual harassment, and professional retaliation that painted a picture of an officer who had been allowed to operate without effective oversight or accountability for an extended period. Rodriguez's team also investigated the institutional mechanisms that had allowed such widespread misconduct to continue unchecked, identifying systemic failures in oversight and accountability that had created an environment where abuse could flourish. Their findings revealed that the problems at Fort Richardson were not isolated incidents but rather symptoms of broader issues within the military's command structure and culture. The CID's investigation attracted attention from congressional oversight committees and military reform advocates, who recognized that the case represented an opportunity to address fundamental problems within the military justice system. The systematic nature of the misconduct and cover-up efforts demonstrated the need for structural reforms that would provide better protection for victims and witnesses, while ensuring that senior officers could not use their positions to escape accountability for criminal behavior. As news of the investigation began to leak to the media, the case attracted national attention and became a focal point for discussions about military culture, accountability, and the treatment of women in the armed services. The public scrutiny added pressure for thorough prosecution and systemic reforms, while also providing some protection for the victims and witnesses who had courageously come forward to tell the truth. The four colonels' attorneys began negotiating with prosecutors as the evidence against their clients became overwhelming and the prospect of lengthy prison sentences became increasingly likely. These negotiations revealed additional information about the extent of misconduct and cover-up activities, while also providing prosecutors with leverage to secure cooperation in identifying and addressing systemic problems within the military command structure. Private Hayes, who had endured weeks of isolation, intimidation, and psychological pressure, finally began to receive the support and protection she deserved as a victim of serious crimes. The military's victim advocacy services, which had been inadequate during the initial stages of the case, were enhanced to provide comprehensive assistance and ensure that she would not face retaliation for her cooperation with the investigation. The investigation's expansion beyond the immediate participants in the cover-up revealed a network of complicity and willful blindness that had allowed the misconduct to continue for years. Junior officers and enlisted personnel who had observed inappropriate behavior but had remained silent due to fear of retaliation were interviewed and provided with protection to encourage their cooperation in building a comprehensive understanding of the problems within the base's command structure. Sergeant First Class Chen and his family were provided with protection and support as his testimony became central to the prosecution's case against the four colonels. His courage in ultimately choosing truth over self-interest had been essential to exposing the full extent of the misconduct, but it had also exposed him and his family to potential retaliation from those seeking to protect their own interests. Captain Williams's role as a whistleblower who had preserved crucial medical evidence despite pressure to alter her findings earned her recognition as a key figure in ensuring that justice could be pursued effectively. Her professional integrity and commitment to accurate medical documentation had provided prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of both the original assault and the subsequent efforts to cover it up. Lieutenant Mitchell and Lieutenant Torres, the two junior officers whose curiosity and integrity had helped expose the cover-up, were recognized as examples of the positive change that could occur when military personnel were willing to challenge misconduct, despite the potential risks to their own careers. Their documentation and analysis had provided crucial evidence that would have been difficult to obtain through other means. As the investigation continued to expand and reveal additional evidence of misconduct and institutional failure, it became clear that the case would result in the most significant military justice prosecution in recent memory. The systematic nature of the crimes and the involvement of multiple senior officers at the same installation demonstrated the need for comprehensive reforms to prevent similar abuses in the future, while ensuring that victims of military crimes would receive appropriate protection and support. The court-martial proceedings against the four colonels began 6 months after the original assault, representing one of the most comprehensive prosecutions of senior military officers for abuse of authority and obstruction of justice in decades. The cases were consolidated into a single proceeding due to the interconnected nature of the crimes and the extensive coordination that had occurred between the defendants in their efforts to cover up misconduct and obstruct the military justice system. Colonel Richard Blackwood faced the most serious charges, including assault, conduct unbecoming an officer, dereliction of duty, and multiple counts of abuse of authority. The prosecution's case against him extended far beyond the single incident involving Private Hayes, encompassing a pattern of violence and intimidation that had characterized his leadership style throughout his career. Additional victims came forward during the investigation, providing testimony about similar incidents that had been previously unreported or inadequately investigated. The evidence presented against Blackwood included detailed medical documentation of injuries sustained by multiple soldiers under his command, witness testimony from personnel who had observed his violent behavior, and electronic records that demonstrated his involvement in efforts to intimidate witnesses and suppress complaints. The prosecution painted a picture of an officer who had systematically abused his authority while relying on the support of his colleagues to avoid accountability for his actions. Blackwood's defense team attempted to portray him as a demanding but effective leader whose tough approach to military discipline had been mischaracterized by disgruntled subordinates seeking to damage his reputation. They argued that the incident with Private Hayes had been an unfortunate accident that occurred during the stress of a training exercise, and that his subsequent actions had been motivated by legitimate concerns about operational security and unit cohesion rather than criminal intent to obstruct justice. However, the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and coordination in the cover-up efforts made it impossible for the defense to credibly maintain that Blackwood's actions were the result of poor judgment rather than deliberate criminal behavior. The detailed documentation of witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and abuse of official resources demonstrated a systematic effort to escape accountability that went far beyond anything that could be justified by legitimate military concerns. Colonel Patricia Vance faced charges related to her abuse of administrative authority, unauthorized access to personnel files, violation of privacy rights, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The prosecution's case against her focused on her systematic use of her official position to gather intelligence about potential witnesses and victims while providing support for the cover-up efforts orchestrated by her colleagues. The evidence against Vance included detailed audit trails from the base's computer systems that documented her unauthorized access to confidential personnel files, witness testimony about pressure tactics she had employed to discourage reporting of misconduct, and documentation of her coordination with other defendants in developing strategies to discredit victims and witnesses. Her pivotal role in the administrative aspects of the cover-up made her one of the most culpable defendants despite not having been directly involved in the original assault. Vance's defense centered on claims that she had been acting under orders from superior officers and that her access to personnel files had been authorized for legitimate administrative purposes. Her attorneys argued that she had been manipulated by more senior officers who had convinced her that her actions were necessary to protect operational security and unit effectiveness rather than to cover up criminal behavior. The prosecution countered these arguments by demonstrating that Vance had extensive experience and training in military regulations and administrative procedures, making it impossible for her to credibly claim ignorance about the improper nature of her actions. Her rank and position had given her the knowledge and authority necessary to recognize and report misconduct rather than participate in covering it up, making her voluntary participation in the conspiracy particularly inexcusable. Colonel Marcus Thompson, as the base commander, faced the most complex array of charges due to his overall responsibility for the installation and his abuse of command authority to facilitate the cover-up efforts. The charges against him included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, dereliction of duty, conduct unbecoming an officer, and abuse of his position as base commander to interfere with official investigations and intimidate witnesses. The prosecution's case against Thompson emphasized his unique position of authority and responsibility within the base's command structure, arguing that his participation in the cover-up represented a fundamental betrayal of his duty to protect the soldiers under his command and ensure the proper functioning of the military justice system. The evidence demonstrated that he had used his command authority to manipulate duty assignments, restrict access to evidence and witnesses, and create an atmosphere of fear that discouraged reporting of misconduct. Thompson's defense strategy focused on portraying him as a career officer who had made poor decisions under pressure, but whose actions had been motivated by genuine concerns about unit morale and operational effectiveness, rather than criminal intent. His attorneys argued that the military's hierarchical structure and emphasis on loyalty had created conflicts between his duty to support subordinate officers and his obligation to pursue allegations of misconduct objectively. The prosecution effectively countered this defense by presenting evidence of Thompson's extensive training and experience in military justice procedures, demonstrating that he had possessed both the knowledge and authority necessary to ensure proper investigation of misconduct allegations. His deliberate choice to abuse his command authority rather than fulfill his legal obligations made him particularly culpable for the systematic failures that had allowed the cover-up to continue for weeks. Colonel Robert Hayes faced charges specifically related to his corruption of the Inspector General function and his deliberate sabotage of what should have been an independent investigation into serious allegations of misconduct. The charges against him included conspiracy, obstruction of justice, conduct unbecoming an officer, and violation of his oath of office as an Inspector General responsible for ensuring compliance with military regulations and standards. The prosecution's case against Hayes focused on the unique nature of his position and the particular trust that had been placed in him to serve as an independent check on command authority and ensure proper investigation of misconduct allegations. His willing participation in the cover-up represented a fundamental corruption of the military justice system's integrity and had denied Private Hayes and other victims their right to proper investigation and resolution of their complaints. Hayes's defense attempted to minimize his role in the conspiracy by arguing that his investigation had been influenced by pressure from superior officers rather than deliberate intent to obstruct justice. His attorneys claimed that the military's emphasis on unit cohesion and chain of command had created conflicts between his duty as an Inspector General and his obligations as a subordinate officer in the base's command structure. The prosecution demolished this defense by presenting evidence of Hayes's extensive training in Inspector General procedures and his clear understanding of the independence and objectivity required in his position. The evidence demonstrated that he had actively coordinated with the other defendants to ensure that his investigation would reach predetermined conclusions, rather than pursue truth and accountability, making him an active participant in the conspiracy rather than a reluctant follower. The trial proceedings attracted significant media attention and public interest, particularly from military reform advocates and women's rights organizations, who recognized the case's broader implications for military culture and accountability. The systematic nature of the misconduct and cover-up efforts provided a clear example of the institutional problems that had allowed abuse to flourish unchecked within military command structures. Congressional oversight committees used the case as a foundation for hearings on military justice reform and accountability, with several of the key witnesses testifying before Congress about their experiences and the institutional failures they had observed. These hearings resulted in legislative proposals for strengthening protections for victims and witnesses while enhancing oversight of senior military officers and improving accountability mechanisms. The testimony provided during the court-martial revealed the psychological toll that the misconduct and cover-up had taken on victims, witnesses, and even some of the participants who had been pressured into cooperation. Private Hayes described the trauma of being assaulted by a superior officer and then systematically intimidated and isolated when she sought justice through official channels. Her testimony was particularly powerful in demonstrating the human cost of the institutional failures that had allowed the misconduct to continue. Sergeant First Class Chen testified about the moral conflict he had experienced when pressured to alter his witness statement and the relief he felt when finally able to tell the truth about what he had observed. His testimony illustrated the difficult position that many military personnel face when confronted with misconduct by senior officers, particularly the tension between personal integrity and career survival that can discourage reporting of serious crimes. Captain Williams provided detailed testimony about the pressure she had received to alter her medical findings and the professional conflict she had experienced between her duty as a medical professional and the expectations placed on her as a military officer. Her testimony demonstrated the importance of maintaining professional standards and integrity even when subjected to pressure from the command structure. The junior officers who had helped expose the cover-up, Lieutenants Mitchell and Torres, testified about their decision to investigate suspicious activities despite the potential risks to their careers. Their testimony highlighted the positive role that conscientious military personnel can play in ensuring accountability and protecting the integrity of military institutions when they are willing to challenge misconduct despite personal risk. The sentencing phase of the proceedings provided an opportunity for victims and their families to describe the impact that the crimes had on their lives and careers. Private Hayes spoke about the lasting psychological effects of the assault and the additional trauma caused by the systematic efforts to discredit her and deny her access to justice. Her victim impact statement was particularly powerful in demonstrating the long-term consequences of allowing military personnel to abuse their authority without effective accountability. The sentences imposed by the military court reflected both the serious nature of the crimes and the need to send a clear message about the military's commitment to accountability and justice. Colonel Blackwood received the harshest sentence, including dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and a significant prison term that reflected both his role as the primary perpetrator of violence and his leadership position in the cover-up conspiracy. Colonel Vance received a sentence that included dismissal from service, substantial financial penalties, and imprisonment that reflected her crucial role in the administrative aspects of the cover-up. The court specifically noted that her abuse of her position of trust and her systematic violation of soldiers' privacy rights represented serious crimes that had undermined the military's ability to protect its personnel from misconduct. Colonel Thompson's sentence included dismissal from service and imprisonment that reflected his unique position of authority and his fundamental failure to fulfill his responsibilities as base commander. The court emphasized that his abuse of command authority had created an environment where misconduct could flourish and had denied soldiers under his command the protection they deserved from their leadership. Colonel Hayes received a sentence that reflected the particular nature of his betrayal of his duties as Inspector General and his corruption of the military justice system's integrity. His dismissal from service and imprisonment served as a clear message that the military would not tolerate the abusive positions specifically designed to ensure accountability and protect service members from misconduct. The broader institutional reforms that resulted from the case included enhanced protections for victims and witnesses, improved training for military personnel on recognizing and reporting misconduct, and strengthened oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the kind of systematic abuse that had characterized the Fort Richardson case. These reforms represented an acknowledgement that individual prosecutions, while necessary, were insufficient to address the cultural and structural problems that had allowed the misconduct to occur. The case also resulted in enhanced support services for military personnel who experienced assault or harassment, including improved access to legal representation, counseling services, and protection from retaliation. Private Hayes became an advocate for these reforms, using her experience to help other victims navigate the military justice system and receive the support they needed to pursue justice. The legacy of the Fort Richardson case extends beyond the individual prosecutions and institutional reforms to serve as a reminder of the importance of integrity, accountability, and courage in maintaining the military's honor and effectiveness. The case demonstrated that even deeply entrenched systems of abuse and cover-up can be exposed and addressed when individuals are willing to stand up for truth and justice despite personal risk. The courage demonstrated by Private Hayes in reporting the assault and persisting in her pursuit of justice despite systematic intimidation served as an inspiration for other military personnel facing similar situations. Her willingness to testify despite the personal cost helped ensure that the full extent of the misconduct was exposed and addressed through appropriate legal channels. The case ultimately proved that the military justice system, despite its flaws and the institutional pressures that can compromise its effectiveness, retains the capacity to hold even senior officers accountable for serious crimes when proper procedures are followed and adequate protections are provided for victims and witnesses. The successful prosecution of the four colonels sent a clear message that rank and position do not provide immunity from accountability for criminal behavior, serving as a deterrent for others who might be tempted to abuse their authority.